Part 1. Intruders. The dawn sun had only begun to warm the faint frost on the ground as a cart was upended, spilling empty wicker baskets and wooden chests on the cold, muddy ground. Pavko, for his part, didn't notice, or he didn't have time to notice. His attention was uncomfortably split between three main concerns: the twists and turns of the alleyway, the uncomfortable vice grip that he had on the cold wooden bow, and the clamor of the guards from around the corner as they gave chase.
"Oi! Stop right there, you runt!"
"After him!" the guards shouted, adding to the din. Pavko winced. He knew these guards, and they weren't his friends. His legs burned, his lungs burned, and his mind burned. The bow wasn't where it was supposed to be. Instead of being secreted away in a hay bale on the outskirts, the bow had been locked up in the guardhouse near the town square. Thankfully, most of the constables were either on patrol or sleeping in their bunks when Pavko found the front door unlocked. "Warm gales bring cold showers," he reminded himself. His family saying was coined by a grand something or other long before his father had been born. The saying followed his family like a shadow and held remarkably true over the generations. Every windfall is met with some drawback. Pavko liked to remain optimistic, but his life had held to that pattern with the stubbornness of stone. As fate would have it, luck would once again prove the wisdom of his family's idiom. Just as he had grabbed the bow and turned towards the exit, a patrolling guard had returned. Pavko froze for barely an instant under the guard's gaze.
"Who are you?"
The guard had managed before Pavko wheeled and ran for the rear door of the guardhouse. He leapt over bunks, some occupied, and dove under the clumsy arms of half-conscious constables until he was out the door and already across the dirty street in the span of an instant. He pushed on through the empty market, a quick left through the tanner's stall and then another left into the neighboring alley. Another right would put him on the path to the gully that ran through the village, that much closer to the stone cart bridge and safety. The underside of the bridge was thick with wild brambles year-round. Encumbered by only the bow that his hands clutched like eagle's talons, he would have no issue hiding under that culvert. His pursuers, weighed down by Gambeson's armor and weapons, wouldn't be able to make the approach, much less make it close enough to peer under the bridge. Pavko pulled at the barbed stems that clung to the fabric of his cloak and dove for the safety of the bridge. He willed his trembling limbs still. He didn't breathe. He didn't think for fear of thinking too loud. He heard the hobnails of the guard's boots pound the stone a scant few inches above his head. The curve of the bow cut uncomfortably against his neck, but he didn't dare readjust. Only when the voices of the guards finally drifted off into silence did he dare move. He could feel the cuts from the thorny brush. His body stung all over. Pain flared noisily along the left side of his body. He had landed on his hip in his desperate leap, and from the burning, painful throb that he felt, at best it was bruised. He didn't want to think about the worst-case scenario. The journey home would be less the marathon that he was used to, and more a death march on a broken hip. But Pavko had survived. For now. "Today is going to be a good day," he muttered to himself sardonically. At that, as if urged on by a contemptful trickster god from a mummer's show, the sky opened up. The overcast morning sky had given way to a storm. His family namesake, Gale, delighted in surprising Pavko with storms and ill weather whenever it could. Some of his acquaintances from town joked that his grandsire must have spent the night with one of those Skellige rain gods. It was Pavko's way to laugh off such claims, but the truth was he would rap twice on the wood of his home whenever he left to ward off such misfortune. Had he remembered to do so when he left his home late last night? The culvert gave him protection against the cold fall rain, but he knew he didn't have time to wait. The townspeople would soon be filling the streets after the commotion that he had caused, and he hadn't thrown himself into a coil of brambles only to be caught by a nosy housewife. He allowed himself just the moment to close his eyes and collect his wits before he pushed himself out of the thicket. He kept low along the gully, more a precaution than anything, until he was finally at the village edge. The guards had long since abandoned the search, but Pavko kept off the road as he moved. He loosened the scarf from around his face. His breath had collected around his beard and the scarf, making both a soggy mess. He knew they hadn't seen his face, but these were people that he did business with every day. The odds of one of them recognizing him from his frame alone were disquietingly high. He quieted the prickling fear rising from his lower back up to his shoulders and pushed on. This bow could cost him everything. The walk home was long. His parents, while they still lived, owned a small farmstead situated well away from the town of Gors-Lucien. Their eccentric choice of situating the farm far away from civilization was noted amongst the townspeople, but they were nonetheless respected whenever they came to town. When illness took them, Pavko was already old enough to take on the duties of running their small farm himself. When the horse died, Pavko carried the goods in a large rucksack that was in a state of perpetual disrepair. "Each patch tells a story," he would joke boastfully when asked, although Pavko himself wasn't sure what a lot of the patches were for. Not anymore, anyway. The pain in his hip had subsided as he made the rise that looked down upon his farm. His kingdom. The paint on the wooden gate had long since flaked away, and the fence was in need of repairs, but the grounds were well kept, and the house still stood proud against the backdrop of the nearby woods. Normally, Pavko would have cause to smile and take in this familiar sight. However, the thought of the intruders currently taking up residence in his home banished any feelings of nostalgia. There were elves in his home. Pavko didn't believe in the superstitious ramblings that passed through the town, but when 3 armed elves wearing war paint barged into his home and ransacked his larders the night previous, Pavko was considerably less open-minded. However, the knife at his throat made any resistance moot. Pavko wasn't a fighter. If the choice was to sit still and live, or fight and die bleeding on the floor of his own kitchen, at the time he believed there wasn't a choice to make. Let them take what they can and then report them to the guard. Besides, these didn't seem like the Scoia'tael that he was used to hearing about in the sermons. They were emaciated and weary, jumping at slight sounds. And the youngest of them carried a baby slung across her breast. She stayed back as the others had threatened Pavko, although the look in her eyes left no doubt as to her opinion on humans. They took food, but it was the demand that they made of him that gave him pause. Eventually, the knife at his throat was released. In truncated common, one of the elves told him about the bow that an ally had carried. Their friend had been caught stealing from the markets of Gors-Lucien, had earned a spot on the gibbet that very day. They mourned their friend, but recovering that bow was important to them. Pavko was given 2 options: be burned alive in his farmstead and cease to be a witness, or retrieve the bow for them. Hardly a choice. Back in the present, Pavko hovered a few feet away from his front door. It was embarrassing to be knocking on his own door, but the elves looked keyed up, nervous. Provoking a mad charge from an overstimulated elf would be a terrible end to a truly terrible morning. The door swung open and he was hauled inside. The tattooed elf manhandled Pavko back into the same seat that they had pressed him to late that previous night. The same elf with the same knife took their same place at his neck. The elf with the child just watched him as the bow was pulled from his hands. "It is not damaged. You live, Dwan," the tattooed one muttered, eliciting a dissatisfied grunt from his captor. Pavko didn't risk a response. Soon enough, another argument had erupted between the elves closest to him, and he didn't like how much they were gesturing to him. The baby then began to cry, their caretaker's attention split between the commotion and the Dwan that could, at any moment, spring forward and gobble the child up. In the din, Pavko was allowed a moment to actually see the contents of the mewling bundle. The child was malnourished. Sallow cheeks stretched over the child's skull, and from out of the swaddle, he could see a tiny rib cage. And he didn't like what he said next. In broken elder tongue, he spoke but one word. "Biog?" They swiveled. 3 pairs of murderous eyes regarded him as if a pile of sick had just asked them what time it was. Confusion, annoyance, and contempt danced across their brows. Biog! Your child needs, Biog! He punctuated each phrase with pantomime. The tattooed elf spat and raised a hand to strike Pavko. But mercifully, the blow was interrupted. The she-elf had grabbed the other's arm. It was his turn to bear her piercing gaze, and he practically wilted. This spurred Pavko on. Biog, down, enough, Biog, for the winter, he cried. A single look from the she-elf was all it took for him to know that he had won. Tattooed elf dropped his arm as the woman stepped forward. You give us food, Dwan. You live. You tell no one, she spat. Her last words were laden with an unspoken threat. He nodded. With the negotiations complete, the elves gathered their haul and departed. The small, familiar cottage suddenly felt still and alien to him. A sanctuary sullied by intruders. They hadn't taken everything, but Pavko was nonetheless filled with helpless venom. If he had tried anything, he may have been able to defeat one and perhaps injure another before being killed himself. He sat for hours, imagining each scenario in turn. Each one ended with him dying on the floor as the survivors ransacked his home. It was humiliating, but he was alive. He thought about the desperation of the intruders, and he thought about the baby, all skin and bones. The other elves he could curse, but what sins had the child committed? He could justify showing them his winter larders as charity, and the thought sat better with him than the others had just a moment before. He had potentially saved a child's life, and come out unharmed in the process. Whether this was a rationalization or not, the thought helped Pavko sleep that night. The peaceful, dreamless oblivion that found him was the perfect balm for his troubled mind. End of Part 1.
Just click here. Everyone knows how it works. There's no point in explaining, to be honest. Hey, do you want to play around with Gwent?